Hi everyone. Good afternoon from Johannesburg, and kind of good morning or good evening, depending kind of depending on where you are. And welcome to this kind of seminar that we're hosting at Wits University this afternoon. It's linked to kind of issues of South Africa's hosting of the G20 kind of this year. In those kind of G20 deliberations, the kind of issue of debt, I think, has been one of the ongoing discussions. And kind of our president has kind of announced a number of initiatives that are linked to the question of kind of addressing debt. There's been two other processes and two kind of other events that have been quite important for the debt agenda for this year. The first is the conference earlier this year, kind of in Spain, on financing for development, or as it's been called, the kind of FFD4 conference was a really important kind of forum for debate and for policy development on the debt issue. I think it's quite clear that this issue is pretty serious. From data that's kind of available, it's quite clear that kind of over 60% of countries kind of are in a kind of debt distress issue, and it's really impacting on kind of important areas of social development as countries grapple with the challenges of managing this debt and the impact of that on budgets in kind of areas such as healthcare. I think to further complicate the issue, kind of a number of developing countries are at the same time having to deal with the energy transition, and the kind of events at COP later this year will be another important space for policy development in this area. So it's really with these three kind of processes in mind that we thought it would be important to host a panel kind of seminar today. And we're really thrilled to have four kind of leading experts to kind of help us to think through these issues. So let me then introduce our panel. So first up is going to be Professor Ulrich Volz, who is the director of the Center for Sustainable Finance at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in London. We'll follow on from Ulrich with kind of inputs from Professor Kunal Sen. Kunal is a great collaborator with South Africa and is director of the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research. We'll then move on to Dr. Karen Groen, who is Senior Fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institute in the USA. And last but not least, we'll bring it to more concrete issues around climate change, with an address by Dr. Crispin Olver, who is the deputy chairperson of the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa. So as a sort of panel, we've shared some kind of initial ideas about how best how best to use this time, and agreed to that each one of our panelists would focus on a slightly different aspect of this larger question. Ulrich is going to kind of provide us with an input that would lay out what this debt issue is, lay out some of the complexities of it, and kind of chart out some of his thoughts on how we might move forward on it. Kunal's interest is really to draw on kind of some of the kind of research and thinking around the sustainability of debt. Karen was kind of among the people who did attend the FF4 kind of meeting, and will make some kind of inputs on that. And Crispin wants to focus specifically on the climate change issues. So with that, let me then pass on to Ulrich for his input for 15 minutes. Over to you, Ulrich.
Thank you so much, Imran. It's really great to be here with all of you. I had the pleasure of visiting Wits University in February, right before the Financing the Financing Commons Summit in Cape Town, and yeah, so great to be reconnected. So as Imran said, I'll kick us off with a bit of an overview of the debt situation facing African countries right now, and I want to frame that, or start by framing the discussion with the vicious circle of debt, underdevelopment, and environmental change that many countries in Africa, but also elsewhere, are facing. So it's important to say that we are focusing here on Africa, but there are indeed a lot of countries also in other parts of the world that are struggling severely with sovereign debt, and we need to urgently address this to halt this vicious circle. And I'll explain a bit more what I mean by that. So back in 2017-18, we did some work together with UNEP, where we looked at the nexus between climate vulnerability and the cost of debt, where we were able to show for the first time that climate vulnerability was actually driving up the cost of capital of climate vulnerable countries, which is then creating a perverse situation where countries that have contributed next to nothing to climate change are not only punished disproportionately by the physical impacts of climate change, but then also a second time by capital markets, because they have to pay a climate risk premium. And we've done a lot of studies on that, also looking at the different transmission channels, and this has been replicated by many, including by the IMF, and they've all basically confirmed that. And back then we framed that in terms of this vicious cycle of climate vulnerability, debt, and underdevelopment, where basically we have climate vulnerable countries that, because of their vulnerability, have to pay a climate risk premium in financial markets. So that translates into a higher cost of capital that the government has to pay, but also everyone else in the economy. So corporations also face this higher cost of capital. This means that there is less fiscal space in governments for investing in climate adaptation and resilience, but of course everything else relating to development. And as climate change gets worse, we have rising vulnerabilities, and then we have this vicious circle in motion. And unfortunately, we see this in motion in many countries now. This brings me, and this, by the way, is also worsened by nature degradation, where we've also done various studies showing how this can threaten sovereign risk. And this brings me now to the African debt situation. So if we look at public external debt by African countries, this has increased massively over the last 2 decades. I'll be very quick with the charts because I don't want to waste too much time on that. So debt has risen significantly in absolute terms, but also in relative terms to GDP in many countries. We have seen a number of other things happening. So quite a number of countries have seen their sovereign credit ratings worsen over the last couple of years, even though we also have seen some small upward trends. But this is kind of the 2019-2025 period. More recently, it has been mostly downwards. We have seen that in the kind of around 2020, the bond yields of African governments were kind of much lower than they are now. They've risen substantially, but they have been already much higher than in other regions to start with. And that, of course, the high cost of capital is a fundamental problem that is threatening debt sustainability. So if you have to pay double-digit interest rates on your debt, then obviously it's going to be much, much more difficult to keep your public debt sustainable. And a further problem is that the African or the external debt of most African countries is in foreign currency, usually US dollar. And we have seen a lot of currency depreciation. So here is the weighted African currencies from December 2015 until just now. And we can see that there's been a massive depreciation trend, which of course then makes debt repayments much, much more difficult as domestic currencies depreciate against the dollar or other international currencies. We have seen interest payments go up as share of overall government expenses. So again, a very clear trend. And this is very worrying. So on average, we have more than 12%, or that's for up until 2023. So we don't have more recent data publicly available now, but end of 2023, on average, more than 12% of government expenses went into interest payments. And that, of course, means that that money, the debt service, the money that's used for debt service is not available for investment in the economy, in fostering sustainable development, of course, also not in climate action, for climate action. Many of you will have come across figures from the UN that are regularly published that health expenditure in many countries absorbs a larger share of government expenditure than debt payments. And we see that very clearly in this chart. So a lot of African countries pay much, much more on debt service than they invest in the health of their people. And you can, of course, take other important areas, education, other social spending, and of course also climate action. So there is really kind of the fiscal situation of many African countries is very difficult. And what I have been arguing with a couple of colleagues, and we've set up an initiative in 2020 called Debt Relief for Green Inclusive Recovery, where we said we have reached a situation where actually a very large number of countries, many of them in Africa, but not only, are really at a point where they cannot sustain reasonable levels of investment in development, but also climate action. And the problem is that this is, the vicious circle that I explained at the beginning is making the situation worse. Yeah, so many countries will not be able to reverse this vicious circle if they will not get some kind of debt relief. And we've produced a number of studies on that, where we've tried to explain in greater detail what should happen. I don't want to go much into that, but the starting point is really that we need really a reform of how debt sustainability is analyzed. And here the key institution is the International Monetary Fund. So for many years, we've been calling on the IMF to reform its debt sustainability analysis. I think Kunal will speak a bit more to that later on. So the problem is that the DSAs, the debt sustainability analyses of the fund, don't really take into account critical investment needs in sustainable development as well as climate action. And so it very much looks at the ability of governments to repay their debt. And governments will do everything they can to repay their debt because they are very fearful of sovereign default and the procedure that would follow with IMF program and so on. And they know that they cannot expect a fair debt restructuring and that they will not get much debt relief. So they really do everything to avoid sovereign default. And that means that they will do everything to prioritize their debt repayments. And that means they will not default on their creditors, but they will default on development. And actually, we had a report published last year at the spring meetings that we called Defaulting on Development and Climate, because critical investments in sustainable development and climate action, especially resilience, adaptation for these countries, are being cut. And this is then feeding the vicious circle that I explained before. So we need to have really much enhanced debt sustainability analysis that does take into account critical investment needs for the SDGs, social expenditures, but also climate adaptation resilience. And if such a comprehensive or enhanced debt sustainability analysis were conducted, the results would be very different from the ones that the IMF publishes. Now, here's a political problem. Of course, everyone knows that if you change these DSAs and account for exactly climate risk, climate spending needs, sustainable development spending needs, more countries will need some kind of relief, and that politically has not been acceptable by the major international donors. And so that's why we haven't seen much action here. So we say we need enhanced debt sustainability analysis, and then for those countries that are shown to need debt relief, we then need to actually have some kind of mechanism, and we've suggested that there should be kind of a updated debt relief initiative building on the experiences of HIPC and so on. But then, of course, not all countries need debt relief. So those that need that have kind of some debt challenges, but that can handle the debt where the debt is still kind of sustainable, they should receive liquidity support, and that's where all kind of things like credit enhancement, SDRs, different types of swaps can come in, but kind of a plain debt for something swap will not be useful in a situation where really solvency problems dominate. We did actually last year kind of a enhanced debt sustainability analysis, and we've just updated one. So we're going to publish a new updated version at the African Climate Summit. And actually the situation has deteriorated. And so if these countries were to spend at the level that the high-level expert group is recommending, then actually the majority of African low-income, lower middle-income countries would need some kind of debt relief. So now this is with World Bank data that were published in December. These are the last available sovereign debt data, and they are for 2023. So, we don't have the full data situation and so on. It's a bit of a crude or kind of a rough calculation, but certainly our analysis suggests that there are a lot of countries, especially in Africa, that will need some kind of debt relief. And debt relief in itself, of course, it's not desirable, but where it's needed, kicking the can down the road will make things just worse, and it will raise the cost on the people, and actually also on kind of international donors and so on, international financial institutions. So what we're having right now is that largely private creditors get away. So we have a lot of funds from MDBs, from the IMF, that are flowing into developing economies, many of them in Africa, and these funds are then used to repay private creditors. So that is effectively a massive public bailout that we're seeing right now. So rather than continue with that, we need to realize that some kind of debt relief will be needed for many countries, not for all, and really make a cut to enable countries that have absolutely no fiscal space to clean their balance sheet, and to start investing again in sustainable development, in resilience, and so to basically turn this vicious circle around into a virtuous circle where we have more investment in adaptation and sustainable development, and build more resilient economies, and then really kickstart growth. So when we put forward these ideas in 2020, 5 years ago, many were saying like, kind of there is no debt crisis and so on. We've then seen over the last years some colleagues saying, oh, no, it's just a liquidity crisis. But I think it's becoming ever more clear that this is not just a liquidity crisis, but it's much more profound, and kind of dealing with piecemeal or kind of piecemeal solutions won't really do. So we need to be ambitious, and there has been, of course, now a lot of work done recently by the UN, by the Jubilee Commission and so on, that effectively are saying pretty much the same. And there is, of course, still a lack of appetite, especially among the large, powerful countries. But even more, it's so it's all the more important that South African G20 presidency has really put this topic right in the center of the G20 deliberations, and so the problems are too big to just ignore, and we can't pretend that this is just a liquidity crisis. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Right, really, many thanks for that. Let's move straight on to Kunal. So kind of Uli has raised some of the kind of issues of sustainability. I think in his kind of input, among other things, Kunal wants to really delve into the sustainability question. So let me pass it on to you then, Kunal.
Yeah, thank you, Imran, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone online. And again, thanks very much, Ulrich, for setting up the stage very well. I'm going to kind of build up on a few of your points that you already made so well. And I wanted just to start with the stark reality that we face right now. And that's the fact is that, as Ulrich mentioned, is the countries are making impossible choice, especially in the developing world. They're choosing to prioritize debt repayment over their people's development. They're defaulting not on their creditors, but on their citizens' futures. That's exactly the stark reality we see right now. This is not just one or two countries. This is a systemic crisis created by the current international financial architecture. It goes far beyond a few countries in any particular region. And in July, my organization, UNU-WIDER, attended the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development that Imran mentioned, and we hosted a side event titled Rethinking Debt Sustainability, to kickstart growth. And what we heard there in the discussion and in Xavier itself should concern all of us. Our panel itself was grounded in the UNE-wide statement on reforming the international financial architecture, which we published in April this year. But more importantly, the panel was grounded in a fundamental question. What if we've been thinking about debt sustainability all wrong? What if we got it wrong? And if you have got it wrong, what do we need to do about it? And I'll speak a little bit about that in my remarks today. But one thing one should keep in mind, going back to F54, going back to Xavier, during the conference, we heard a powerful message from member states, international financial institutions, multilateral organizations, who said that debt sustainability should not be measured simply by a country's capacity to repay. It should be measured by how much growth and wealth that debt can generate. And I think that's the way we should start thinking about debt and debt sustainability going forward. But of course, if we start thinking about it in this kind of way, we need to think about how we reconceptualize debt itself. And the problem here is to make the shift in paradigms and our thinking about debt and debt sustainability, we need systemic changes across multilateral development banks and credit institutions, as pointed out by Ulrich early in the discussion. The good thing we think, and we felt fairly optimistic when we came back from Xavier, is the compromise of the Xavier was fairly clear about this. It acknowledged that sovereign debt challenges have become one of the greatest obstacles to realizing sustainable development. That was pretty much loud and clear in the discussion that we had in Xavier. But then the question is that if that's the case, what kind of financial architecture do we need to meet? Do we need to meet these commitments that Xavier promised? And the way I think we see it is that we think there are four commitments that we think came out very clearly, and there may be others. First was strengthening debt management, debt transparency, and responsible borrowing, number one. Number two is lowering the cost of borrowing and providing more support to developing countries, especially low-income countries. Third, debt structuring should be timely, orderly, effective, fair, and negotiated in good faith, predictable, and coordinated. And fourth, ensuring that debt sustainability and credit assessments are accurate, objective, and term-oriented. These are the four commitments we think are very important to highlight in discussion today. Let me start with what I think are the two most in our view, and then we go on to three more. So what we think are the 5 reforms we need to see following compromise of their Xavier's commitments of debt. First, there is absolutely an urgent need for a permanent institutional mechanism to restructure sovereign debt, preferably operating within the United Nations system, but it could also possibly be under the International Monetary Fund. So that's something that's up for discussion. We know that the common framework for debt treatment has been painfully slow. Only 4 countries have applied to date, largely because private creditors are reluctant to participate because of the threat of credit rating downgrades. So 4 countries have participated so far, but many more can if we have the right kind of restructuring mechanism. So what we need is a permanent mechanism that operates in 3 stages, each with fixed deadlines: voluntary renegotiation, mediation, and arbitration. So voluntary renegotiation, mediation, arbitration. And we need fixed deadlines to make sure that other countries also participate. And this mechanism, of course, must ensure comparable burden sharing among all creditors, including new official creditors and private creditors. That's obvious that has to be the case. So this is something that could be done more, perhaps, following Xavier. And we need to see more momentum in creating this permanent restructuring mechanism that it goes beyond the common framework of debt treatment. And we haven't seen that as yet. And of course, the mechanism must fully incorporate, as Ulrich mentioned, the impacts of climate change on revenues and government expenditures, potentially pairing this with climate-linked conditionalities. So that has to be also the case. The second important reform we need, this is already has been discussed, is around debt sustainability analysis framework, the DSA framework, which is used by the IMF and the World Bank to guide borrowing, lending, and researching decisions. This needs fundamental rethinking. Why? And let me begin by saying that we're already hearing from the IMF and the bank that there will be a concerted process to reform the DSA framework. We heard that in Xavier. But we hope it will lead to more nuanced, more multifaceted analysis of debt sustainability based on vulnerabilities such as climate vulnerability, operative capacity. So while there's been a discussion now to reform the DSA framework, we need more impetus and a much more clarity on exactly what that would be. Why? Well, if you look at the current form that we have the DSA framework, it advocates for a suboptimal level of government spending investment. It fails to incorporate the full scale of investment needed. And it does not adequately account for economic and other external shocks. It even overstates the potential of fiscal consolidation to generate economic growth. So there are a lot of things that gets wrong in the current framework. Most problematically, the methodology itself in the DSA framework isn't sufficiently sensitive to the long-term benefits of debt-financed investment. So investment in the green transition, in infrastructure, human capital, and so on, that can actually support long-term debt sustainability. So so there's a problem both in the way it approaches debt, but also in the methodology itself. And the DSA framework should incentivize growth-driving investment and serve as a tool to sustainably manage debt rather than reducing debt levels at all costs. We need lending decisions based on long-term models of debt sustainability, much more accurate models of debt sustainability, not simple rule of thumb ways of trying to calculate the arbitrary debt to GDP ratios, which is what we have right now. So rather than undermining debt sustainability, investment-driven borrowing can be linked to low sovereign debt risks and should be incentivized in the way the framework operates to finance sustainable development and kickstart economic growth in low-income countries. So it's a rethinking and also a paradigm shift in the way we think about debt. The debt itself can be the way to get out of the current development problems that we see in many low-income countries. Now, but I just want to make a couple of more points about other things we think are very important. And hopefully I got some few minutes more for that. One is something that I don't think is discussed enough in this, it didn't even, wasn't really brought up in Serbia as much as it could have been. And that's to do with what is called, we can call a hidden debt problem. So what is a hidden debt problem? Unreported or misreported government liabilities, which are undermining accurate debt analysis. We can't have a DSA that works if we don't have accurate debt analysis. And of course, by having such unreported or misreported government liabilities, we erode public trust, citizens on how they can hold their own governments to account. This is particularly severe in countries with weak institutions and for debts owed to commercial and bilateral creditors. It's not a big issue when it comes to official creditors. So what's the solution? Well, we need a sovereign debt registry. Think of it as a central clearinghouse that enhances transparency in debt data and agreements, makes government borrowing terms accessible to both lenders and borrowers. Think about this as a way to strengthen debt management, reduce the risk of debt distress, and improve access to financing. But this is one facade. This has to do with the borrowers themselves. But at the same time, transparency cannot be a one-way street. Creditors, especially commercial banks and bilateral creditors, must also strengthen the transparency of their lending practices. We need loan-by-loan public dissemination of credit statistics, and we don't have that as yet. This would provide a straightforward way to check debtor-reported numbers, because when you had balance sheets, we have information both to credit and debtor side, and severely limit sovereign's ability to hide their liabilities. The hidden debt problem is a problem that needs to be tackled right away. And then a couple of other points. One is something that Ulrich also mentioned, of the role of MDBs, multilateral development banks. It's quite obvious they are very important in lowering borrowing costs, in providing more support to developing countries. But they need to fundamentally change the way they operate and how they operate. And we didn't hear enough of that in Serbia. They should be providing more long-term, low-cost financing, including concessional financing to low-income countries. They should be lending more in countries' national currencies to manage exchange volatility, which also support the development of domestic capital markets. Critically, they must play a counter-cyclical role during major shocks and crises. When the private sector pulls back, MDBs should step in, allowing countries to remain resilient and providing necessary liquidity. And all of these things are something we've heard many times before in discussion of MDB reforms, including the G20, but we haven't really seen that. And of course, MDBs can incentivize private investment. That's important. And through well-designed policy conditionalities, like guarantees, insurance mechanisms, so on, that can align private sector interests with long-term sustainability goals. So there's a lot that can be done even on that front. And the final point I want to make is about credit rating systems and credit rating agencies. One of the good things that happened in Serbia is there were several sessions, several discussions around credit rating agencies. And those are really, very important because we must address the outsized influence of credit rating agencies and on the cost of capital of developing countries. Again, that's something that already was mentioned earlier. So we have a situation where we have a credit rating impasse that is deterring countries from seeking necessary debt relief. So we need more transparency from credit rating agencies, which are mostly these large private sector companies, including public release of long-term scenario analysis and simulations of debt dynamics under various assumptions. We need clarity and transparency from the private sector on this. But also there are other proposals that are being discussed, and we should think about them seriously. And our view is that some of these proposals have merit, but they need to be thought through a bit more carefully. One of them is the African Credit Rating Agency, something that we should think about, or even a global public credit rating agency, something that is not in the private sector, but in public hands. So the point here is that there's a lot more that be done around credit rating agencies. The conversation has started in Serbia. That was very encouraging, but we need to do more. So 5 reforms that I'm proposing here: more transparency through a sovereign debt registry, bigger, better, and more effective MDBs, a permanent mechanism for debt restructuring, better debt sustainability analysis, and a fairer credit rating system. May sound straightforward on paper. Of course, it does. They seem very straightforward, but in reality, they require significant political buy-in. And this is where South Africa can play an important role in this G20 discussions, in mobilizing countries around these reforms. And that's something that can happen in the G20 this year. So I'm just going to end by saying that we have an urgency right now. We are facing a debt sustainability crisis of unprecedented scale. Only 60 developing countries are either in, over 60 developing countries are either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. So this is not just about numbers in the balance sheet, it's about real consequences for real people. So let's try and think through these reforms and let's try and see how we can actually enact them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kunal. I'm having a few internet problems, so I might have to turn off my camera from time to time. I think let's move straight on to Karen. Both Kunal and Ulrich have dealt with the issues of what needs to be done, and I think that's really the focus that Karen wants to have for her presentation. So over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Imran, and you're absolutely right. I think I'm going to say some things that are quite complementary to what Uli and Kunal have mentioned, but maybe with some additional twists from more of a feminist economics perspective, since that's the realm that I've been working in. And I want to make one reflection on the FFD. It was a very interesting conference. It happened. I think the things that came out of the FFD happened because the U.S. was not there. The U.S. is really the elephant in the room in all of these discussions right now. And I am really hopeful that the G20 will actually take over what is now kind of the leadership vacuum and be able to continue to pursue some really important and good things that have been proposed by our colleagues here, but also in Sevilla. I'm going to speak about some of the international issues, but I also want to talk a little bit about what can be done at the national level by governments, particularly around domestic resource mobilization, which I think is really, really important, particularly in light of changes in, reductions in pullbacks from overseas development assistance and foreign aid. Countries have a huge lift in terms of mobilizing domestic resources. So I'll say a few words around that. I want to just also emphasize what I think needs to be done, or, as Kunal said, is we need to change our paradigms. This is really a moment where paradigm change is quite important. And if we change our paradigms, that has implications as well for the way our instruments for debt restructuring, write-off, domestic resource mobilization, the way these instruments are actually being deployed. So the first point I want to make is that it's a general point that's been made by the Jubilee Commission, by my colleagues here at Brookings. It's not that it's too much debt. It's too much of the wrong kind of debt. And it's too little of the kind of debt that actually does support sustainable development. And what do I mean by that? It's too much focus on short-term capital and much less focus, too little focus on long-term investment, as Kunal has emphasized. We need to focus much more on the quality of debt, and I fully agree with Uli and Kunal that there's different ways to do that. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Another part of the paradigm change is expanding our notion of what, at the national level, what constitutes fiscal space. The IMF definition is, we're expanding spending for priority spending, that there's room in a government budget, that it's the room in a government budget that allows it to provide resources for desired purposes without jeopardizing financial stability of the economy. But the idea there is that the fiscal space is a limited resource. But I think we can reframe fiscal space not just as a limited resource, but as a resource that can be expanded. And if we place more emphasis in the discussion of fiscal rules and fiscal space on social and environmental sustainability, which is, in turn, influences the financial sustainability of a budget over the medium to the long term, we can actually get these virtuous circles. There are feedback loops that are really important. And I want to make the point that the use of fiscal space for public investment is a really critical point right now. And I'm going to come back to that public investment shortly. We know that, and the IMF has increasingly adopted the paradigm shift from counter-cyclical policies to moving away from pro-cyclical policies to counter-cyclical policies. That's really important. It's important in the MDB lending. The failure to engage in counter-cyclical spending has even more negative impacts on fiscal space than doing nothing. Counter-cyclical spending can, in fact, attenuate the narrowing of fiscal space that results during economic recessions and crises. And counter-cyclical spending can also attenuate hysteresis, the negative effect of sustained economic downturns on labor productivity. And that negative effect results from the effect of long-term unemployment on workers' skills and thus productivity, or simply the physical effects of deprivation on health and therefore education and productivity. And I think this is really important because it matters for what feminist economists call social reproduction, which is really the non-market production of human capabilities and human capital, both in the short term as well as in the long term. So this leads me to my last point on the paradigm change, which some our colleagues have mentioned, but I think is important in the discussion of what is a good public investment. And everybody agrees that investment for infrastructure is key, sustainable green infrastructure in particular, whether it's renewables or other types of infrastructures that move us to a green transition. But I also want to make the point that there's social infrastructure. The social infrastructure it refers to things like physical infrastructure projects for social use, things like school buildings and medical clinics. That physical infrastructure cannot be run without people. So we have to reframe the way we think, both in a public budgeting context, as well as the way we think about social infrastructure, of investments in decent quality work that are part of a physical infrastructure investment. So it's social infrastructure. And the other part of social infrastructure that's really important is financing for care of children, of the elderly, of those who have disabilities. Everybody will need care at some point across their life cycle. The need for care only increases with climate change, and I've done some work including a new piece that's coming out for how we use climate adaptation finance for care, but we need to bring care in to the issue of social infrastructure. That's really important. The other piece about social infrastructure that relates to physical space is that these investments are properly classified as infrastructure spending, the investments in the services for infrastructure, as I mentioned, health systems, education systems. We need to reclassify them as infrastructure spending, not just government current consumption or human development expenditures. And I think if we classify these expenditures as infrastructure, that's important for the way that we will deploy public investments. So let me say a few words now about some of the instruments and the way we think about them for debt, fiscal space, and public investment. My colleague Mahmoud Mohideen, who's a non-resident fellow here at Brookings and who was the lead for the Secretary General's expert group on debt, issued an 11-point proposal called Confronting the Debt Crises. These are 11 actions to unlock sustainable financing, and they very much overlap with what Uli and Kunal have already mentioned, but I want to add a few things to these interesting proposals. So there's a lot of calls that I think are really important, and I want to call them out here, that we can still do in the short term that are important. We can formalize standstills and pauses in debt contracts. This notion has gained credibility with the Bridgetown Initiative, particularly around climate. I hope Crispian will speak about that a little bit more. That these can be done in an automatic, stabilizing way. But one thing that I've thought about is perhaps we can think about debt, they're called climate resilient debt clauses. Maybe we can think about social resilient debt clauses. Maybe there can be social triggers when countries' social infrastructure, education, health, poverty rates are being depleted so rapidly or below poverty lines that maybe debt, we can include these kinds of suspensions or standstills in debt clauses as well. Another thing that I think is really important in the short term that comes from Mahmoud's proposals and his commission's proposals, which I think is important for South Africa, are setting up things like borrower clubs. The creditors have creditor clubs. I think a borrower club is really important, where borrowers can get together with greater force and collective action to renegotiate debt, restructuring, write-offs, and those kinds of things. Both Uli and Kunal mentioned debt sustainability frameworks, importantly for the way that the IMF assesses the positions of low-income countries and low-medium income countries. It's really important, and I fully agree with them, to update the methodology for these frameworks. The methodologies need to be able to distinguish between things like liquidity issues and solvency issues. They need to take account of all forms of external debt and domestic debt, and they should serve to encourage investment in growth-enhancing public goods, something I alluded to earlier, by adequately reflecting the net worth of countries, not just their debt level. And here a feminist economist would say by assessing the net worth of a country, we also need to include the value of different types of assets that men and women hold and the value that unpaid work contributes to an economy. And a lot of good commissions have been set up over the years to think about methodologies for incorporating values of unpaid work, that what's produced by unpaid work in national income and product accounts. And I think those ideas can influence these discussions. I fully agree with, I don't remember who said it, the IMF, and I'm really happy, I think that they're going to do this, is to change their rules for not allowing countries that have received IMF lending, not allowing countries to pay private creditors out of that out of the IMF loan or the World Bank loan. I think that's enormously important that to put those clauses in. And finally, Kunal and Uli mentioned expanding, reforming the MDBs. I'm not going to jump into that conversation, but I do think that some of the reform proposals for the IMF and the World Bank and the regional development banks have to do with the ways in which concessional finance is expanded. And one idea there is to rechannel what the IMF special drawing rights are beyond the IMF to go to some of the regional development banks and to allow special drawing rights to be used for public investment in health, education, and care. I want to spend my next few minutes just saying a few things about some of the national level instruments that are really important. My colleagues have, at the ICTD, the International Center on Tax and Development, have called the next decade the tax decade for development. Countries, in light of all of these changes and without reforms immediately, these reforms that I mentioned and others have mentioned will take time, really need to think through how they mobilize domestic resources. And there's big issues there for taxation. Tax is the single own source revenue for countries, and it's enormously important. But there's things that countries can be doing in the way that they allocate the revenue from taxes to public investments. So the first thing I want to start with at the national level is thinking on the expenditure side, something that we call expenditure switching. This is getting rid of, and we know all too well that this is important, fossil fuel subsidies or subsidies to large landowners and mineral extracting firms. We need to get rid of those subsidies, and those can be redirected towards investments that promote the right type of growth, gender equality. So, for instance, ways that we could do that, removing these kinds of subsidies, for instance, to large landowners or agribusiness firms and mineral extractors, has little, if any, negative impact on their investments in a country, and that's the growth of a country. And that's because those resources are tied to the domestic economy. And if those firms are import intensive, those subsidies leak out of the domestic economy, reducing whatever positive effect their investments may have on growth and then on fiscal space that I talked about earlier. So shifting government spending out of those kinds of subsidies to investments in physical and social infrastructure can stimulate productivity, create decent, well-paid jobs that generate tax revenue. It can reduce the debt burden, and it can increase fiscal space in the long term. Public investment, as I mentioned, can be not only well targeted, it can be anti-inflationary, and I think that's an additional benefit if it addresses supply bottlenecks that drive up prices, and it reduces pressure on central banks to raise interest rates. And feminist economists have have really emphasized the potential that these investments can be self-financing, because investments of this kind have the capacity to raise income and generate a stream of revenue in the future. But that goes back to the paradigm change of moving away from short-term approaches to longer term, thinking about investments over a 10-year time horizon to expand the productive base of the economy. So we need patient capital. We need to think about this a 10-year period that accounts for the endogenous effects of public investment. And in my final minutes, I just want to mention a few things that I think are really important from a perspective to mobilize domestic resources. Countries can do much better in the ways that they raise domestic revenue. We've heard a lot of calls for progressive taxation. That's super important. There are many ways that countries can improve the taxation of wealth and the taxation of capital income. Our colleagues and friends, Gabriel Zucman and others in Paris, and Joe Stiglitz have talked about ways that even low-income countries can raise wealth taxes, implement wealth taxes. The most important thing that I think is really important that hasn't gotten as much attention and didn't get as much attention in Sevilla is we can also minimize the regressivity of the types of taxes that fall very heavily on poor people and poor informal enterprises or poor informal workers. We have a compendium coming out here in the next few weeks on innovations in public finance that talk about what governments can do in terms of the rebalancing the types of taxes that they implement and how they can minimize regressivity by better targeting, by transparency. And I want to mention here my last point on domestic resource mobilization is that I think that climate finance we have to think about the overlay of climate finance, both for mitigation and for adaptation, as part of the larger public finance in a country context. And this compendium that I mentioned talks about innovations in climate adaptation finance that promote resilience and sustainability, both of the social system, social infrastructure, as well as the ecosystem and environmental sustainability. So all of the things that I've mentioned, both at the international level and at the domestic level, I think will be important ingredients for a just transition. And I think that we need to put these all together as part of the packages for South Africa and the G20, but also for civil society organizations that are mobilizing their governments and international institutions to make this the decade of the just transition. So let me stop there.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Karen, and kind of great to have the feminist view on these questions. Let's move on then to Crispin, who's our last panelist. Crispin's going to focus a lot more on the climate change issues, but he has the license to say things more kind of broadly, and was also at the civil conference as all of our panelists were. So over to you, Crispin.
Thank you, Imran, and once again, very good afternoon, everyone. So, I mean, let me start by saying that Sevilla was uncomfortably hot. It was the start of the heat dome that has continued to affect Europe throughout the summer, and as you've seen, has led to a massive tinderbox that has ignited and burned large parts of Greece and Spain and other southern European countries. So it really helped sort of sharpen the mind as we were there of what a warmer future is going to be like. And it's, you know, it's almost impossible to contemplate doing any kind of manual labor outside in those conditions. I was tracking discussions, not from the perspective of debt. I mean, the issue I've been tracking globally is what we call country platforms. And those of you in South Africa will know, I mean, we've got a country platform of our own called the JETP. There are 3 other countries that have also done energy transition platforms, and you've seen others emerging. Egypt's doing one on food, water, and energy. Brazil has done one on ecological transformation. There are a number of African countries working on adaptation and resilience. And you're seeing energy access as also a very big issue emerging across Africa. So, you know, what makes these platforms successful is that they're long-term programmatic interventions led by countries. So they're country-driven, not plans that are written in Washington or Paris. And they're backed by an integrated capital stack. So the goal is to get all parts of the financial system to work in an integrated way. And obviously, debt is key to that. But, you know, the foundation for any kind of capital stacking exercise is, of course, your own resources, starting with sound financial management and creating the right fiscal space for you to do these transactions. Also, integrating climate risks across the way that you think about public finance. As some of our other speakers have said, dealing with the fact that we're, you know, continuing to very heavily subsidize fossil fuels and tracking your expenditures through things like climate budget tagging. For many developing countries, I mean, the grant and concessional component of these packages is very important. And, you know, I don't need to tell you as an audience, we're dealing with a very constrained global environment. I mean, most of our development partners have prioritized defense over ODA. So in aggregate, there's probably a 40% drop in ODA across the board. But even in that context, there's an enormous amount we can do to reduce fragmentation, increase ease of access, increase flexibility, and get much more leverage out of the very scarce grant resources that we do have available. So I was, you know, quite encouraged by the outcomes at Severe. I mean, for those of you that wanted to see a fundamental transformation of the system, I think you would have been disappointed. Severe, you know, the Compromiso de Sevilla was very much an incrementalist and practical set of recommendations. But there was a fair amount that I thought was of huge significance for the platforms that we've been developing. So, you know, on the subject of concessional finance, you know, reinforcing the push which has been coming through the G20 around a massive ramping up of concessional finance, we need at least a 3-fold increase. We need to get the different MDBs and NDBs working as a system, and in particular for developing countries, foreground our own national banks and push local currency lending as a, you know, a hedge against exchange rate volatility, and also get the balance sheets of the MDBs to stand behind our national banks. And I know not every developing country has national banks, but those that do, like Brazil, have brought them into the foreground of their platforms. And then, you know, on the subject of commercial debt and equity, I mean, you know, a lot has been said already. You know, some of my friends think debt is a bad thing. I think it is both a quality issue and it's a question of how you use debt. And in the climate space, we've been making putting a huge amount of emphasis on bringing the climate development and prosperity agendas together. So I would not advocate borrowing for measures that are not going to grow the economic pie. I mean, that's ultimately the logic behind many of the infrastructure investments that we're trying to do with these platforms. What FFD certainly did do, I mean, there was a big focus on the cost of capital. As you know, Trevor Manuel's running this Africa expert panel, and there was South Africans had a really interesting session where the work of the panel was highlighted. I think they've been given an extremely difficult subject to tackle. The credit rating agencies, I mean, I guess the one positive thing that you can say about them is that they pitched up. They were the single most unpopular people at FFD, and, you know, clearly came in for quite a lot of attacks. And, you know, I guess the demand from us as developing countries is that we want the implicit bias that these agencies are operating on, that, you know, middle income and low income countries must have this exorbitantly high risk premium attached to us. I mean, it's around those margins that we need to play. So the fact that they're in the conversation, I thought, was a really good starting point. A couple of comments on the more specifically climate-related measures. I mean, a lot was said about debt for climate, debt for nature, and debt for development swaps. And there is a strong logic to these. So, you know, these are basically global public goods. And to the extent that they have value for everyone, there is the basis for a commercial transaction to transfer or cancel debt in relation to GPG outcomes. And I was very encouraged by the, you know, move to set up this global hub for debt swaps for development. I think it's a good initiative and we should support it. There was also an enormous amount of discussion on state contingent debt clauses. I mean, basically what you'd call pause clauses. So this is in response to extreme shocks. So, I mean, obviously climate shocks are one of the kinds of shocks, and the SIDS made a very convincing case. I mean, the kinds of severe events they get exposed to can literally obliterate their economies and set them back in terms of years. So there's, and, you know, we've seen that in Africa, not just extreme weather events, but I mean, certainly COVID was a shock which pushed many countries in Africa into a highly indebted and debt distressed situation. So we've seen how these economic shocks operate, and to have the kind of flexibility that you need to respond to those shocks and special provisions in order to ensure liquidity in response to those shocks is extremely important. So, you know, that's why, you know, the G20 work that South Africa is pushing on revamping the common framework, I think, is particularly relevant. So, you know, for those of you that are familiar with it, you know, pushing for faster, more inclusive and more accessible provisions, expanding the eligibility of those provisions, not just to LICs, but also middle-income countries, and being a little bit more responsive to borrower experiences. I mean, these are very important issues. And you also saw at Severe the, move towards a borrowers club. And this, of course, injects a note of real fear into the lenders. I mean, the idea of the developing world clubbing together in order to stand up against them, certainly is unpopular amongst the lenders. But we felt the need for it. I mean, certainly in the country platform space where I operate, we're all individually as developing countries negotiating very complex integrated financing packages, and the ability to share experiences, collaborate around reform issues that we need addressed is vitally important. So let me leave it at that point, Imran, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Right. Let me then thank kind of Crispin and all of the panelists for their input. We don't have lots of time for kind of questions, but I thought what we might do is to just go among the panelists to see if they would like to take up any points that have been made in the presentations, and then we can take one round perhaps of kind of questions from the audience. So I'm going to go in reverse order. Karen first, Kunal next, Uli, and then come back to you, Crispin. Just a kind of an appeal to, if we could try to keep the input short, we will then have some time for one round of questions from the audience. So over to you, Karen, for any points you want to take up.
Thanks. I think I'm going to start with the last point that Crispin made, because I think it's really important and I made earlier too, about the need for borrowers clubs. But I think there's an underlying theme of all of our presentations about the need for collective action. And collective action is really important in terms of reform of the MDBs, in terms of setting up any kind of new debt architectures, in terms of helping countries to mobilize against the kinds of leakages from their domestic economies that erode their tax base and domestic resource position. But we have a real political problem right now globally with collective action. And I really think we need to think harder about how countries can use their power together to implement some of the good ideas that we've all been discussing here. And I think it's a hard one because we've seen many governments cave to the biggest bully in the room right now, including the Europeans, which I thought would be the bulwark against the bully, who will be unnamed. But I think new forms of collective action and ways that countries themselves can really unwind themselves a little bit from the bully in the room to wield their economic voice and their economic power. And I think that's really difficult right now. So when we talk about MDB reform, I'm a little bit more pessimistic because of the role of some of the shareholders, the one shareholder in particular on the executive boards, the governing boards of the bank and the fund, and the ability of other shareholders to really stand up in these contexts. I worry quite a bit about the UN. I'm very much in favor of the UN being the umbrella for many of the things that we think are important. For instance, the International Tax Convention, for even the debt restructuring. But the UN is seriously weakened right now, and we really need to think about these institutions, if we're going to continue to think about where we can have this collective action, how we restructure and rethink the UN. For me, this is very uncertain. I don't know in which way it will go, but I do thinking through collective action is going to be a really important task for us going forward. let me stop there. I have other things to say, but I'll
Right.
hand the floor over to my colleagues.
Right. Oh, kind of over to you, Kunal.
Yeah, just very 2 points. One, I think, is about the question that Crispin also brought up around this some institutional mechanism to solve this sovereign debt problem. And right now, the common framework isn't working. We all know that. But then the question is, should it sit in the UN or not? Now, there's a lot of people would say yes, and then you think, well, politically, and I think Karen's alluding to this, it seems like a non-starter. And should one even think about the International Monetary Fund being the agency that oversees the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism? Sounds at one level very contradictory, because they seem to have contributed to some extent with the problems that we see on debt. But other level, you might think that might be the more practical option. So I think that it's a discussion to be had. In my view, maybe there is an argument not to have it in the UN, actually. But this is something we need to think about. The other point that even Karen mentioned is that right now the big discussion that's going on in New York and elsewhere is on the UN Tax Convention. And the UN Tax Convention, the real big issue is about taxing cross-border services. And there we know that the OECD two-pillar solution hasn't worked. And of course, there we see very clear division of views between the richer countries in the West, not just the US, but other countries too, and the developing countries, especially the Africa group. And I think it's a really now for us as economists and others, policy analysis, to get really into these discussions, because these are tricky issues. And we need, especially developing countries, need good advice from especially economists, I would say, on these sorts of issues. How do we think about cross-border services, digital services? And why is it the case that right now we still don't have a clear solution to the fact that Amazon and Google and so on sell all the services to countries in Africa and elsewhere that don't have to pay taxes, right? So I think this is something that I think is going to become a really central issue now, post F54, especially with the tax convention discussion going on. Thanks.
Over to you, Uli.
Yeah, thank you. I want to make 2 points. First, there are two issues really. One is addressing the current debt crisis, and the other thing is kind of addressing the structures that lead to these crises. So about preventing future crises. And I want to re-emphasize the point that I made in the presentation, that we do have a large number, and I think pretty much everyone agreed on that. We do have a large number of countries that really are defaulting on development because they are scared of defaulting on their debt. So we do need to find mechanisms that will provide relief in the short run, and a mechanism that then helps to link it to progressive investment in sustainable development and also climate action. This is absolutely critical, because otherwise we're just going to see progress in the Agenda 2030 reversing further and so on, and of course also the climate agenda. So that is absolutely critical. But then, and I agree very much with. It's always risky to say everything that's been said, but at least let me qualify most of what's been said regarding reforms to international financial system and so on. So this also needs to be pushed, of course. Then the second point I want to make, and that's following up on something that Karen emphasized, the role of domestic financial resource mobilization can't be overemphasized. So there has been very rightfully a lot of discussion about the cost of capital. I myself have been talking about the cost of capital for a long time. But a lot of people seem to think that international measures could suffice to bring down the cost of capital. But at the end of the day, to really fundamentally bring down the cost of capital in developing countries, emerging countries, and address one of the big bottlenecks to development, the only way to really structurally address the problem is to strengthen domestic financial resource mobilization. So that is strengthen domestic savings, develop a local financial system, banking system, and capital markets to really mobilize domestic financial resources. So if you look a little bit at economic history, there is really, except for some petrostates perhaps, no country that was able to develop without strengthening domestic financial resource mobilization. And in almost all cases, public development banks, public financial institutions played a really critical role. And so that links back to Seville, where we actually had a side event with the German government and partners, different national, regional development banks on domestic financial resource mobilization and the role that national development banks and developing country-led regional development banks can play. And the important point here, there is a lot that MDBs, that international DFIs can do to really empower national development banks to play a much, much more important role. And this is really about creating local currency financing, which at the end of the day is really what is most needed. So, for example, most of the climate finance actually needs to be in local currency finance because renewable energy, will not generate FX. Many climate-related investments will not generate FX, so they need to be financed in local currency. So there is a huge agenda about strengthening national development banks, strengthening local financial system, capital markets, and so on. There's also a lot of kind of stuff that can be done, for example, on digital sustainable finance to really empower that. And I should stop now, but a lot of low-income countries, lower middle-income countries will not be able to manage accessing international capital markets. We just published a study on that. The risks are just too large on that. So for those countries, we really need to work much more with intermediaries, such as MDBs, but we also, for example, should empower the multilateral climate funds to also issue bonds in capital markets to, as has been done now with international climate funds, to raise private capital in international markets at low cost and then pass it on at low cost to developing countries, rather than have these countries directly go to capital markets and pay unsustainably high cost of capital. Thank you.
Right, Crispin?
Thanks, Imran. So let me touch on one issue that I don't think we've adequately aired, which is the subject of insurance. And in the climate adaptation space, I mean, if you're wanting to really understand, we're moving into a highly uncertain world. But if you're wanting to understand probabilities around extreme weather events and their impact on a whole range of interlinked issues, including livelihoods, financial sustainability, etc., you need to talk to the insurance sector. They've modeled these things to the nth degree, and I'm on the adaptation side, I'm trying to get them to play a far more active role in terms of putting these country platforms together. But there's an aspect of insurance which I wanted to mention. So, most developing countries are highly constrained in terms of their ability to issue sovereign guarantees. Generally, and I include South Africa, treasuries are very reluctant to issue new sovereign guarantees. And the challenge is how to engineer non-sovereign lending and to unlock private investment at scale. But in some instances, you at least need partial guarantees to make that work. And we've been experimenting, I mean, this is with the World Bank Multilateral Investment Guarantee Facility, what's called a blended finance credit guarantee vehicle, where Treasury takes a partial position, but it doesn't own all of the equity in the vehicle. And we're bringing the balance sheets of large MDBs to play collectively behind that vehicle. And it ultimately ensures, so we're doing this now, for instance, for our grid infrastructure rollout. And what we're able to do with some fairly complex engineering is bring down the cost of capital for that with some targeted insurance on the PPP projects. So I do think that's an area where other developing countries might find a little bit of headroom. we're playing at the margins. We're all in fiscally constrained positions. But for us, it's allowed to get Treasury behind this huge R1 trillion of grid infrastructure investment that's required. Thanks.
Right, so we've got just 4 minutes left, and I want to keep to time because we can all have other commitments. So just a final round among the panelists with a question around the what Karen called the elephant in the room, which is the kind of international kind of inequality in power here. So kind of closing question, starting from Karen, any advice on what you think South Africa should be doing kind of through the G20 process, especially since it moves from South Africa to the USA?
I really think that leadership is important at this time, alternative leadership. And I think the leadership of the, whether you want to call it the BRICS or whether you want to call it the large economies of the global South really taking forward this vacuum. I'm very pessimistic. I mentioned earlier that Europe is going to do this, but I really think this next decade really needs to be the decade of global South power, and I think that South Africa can do that. There is a comment in the chat to Crispin about the politics in South Africa right now, and I think that the internal politics in many countries, whether it's India or other countries, are a factor that we have to think about in terms of the ability for collective action. I think because of where I see such great destruction from where I sit right now of institutions that we thought were so formidable being much weaker than we thought, I'm a little bit more pessimistic about mechanisms, places and spaces that have been so important. So I'm a little bit more pessimistic about the UN. I'm a little bit more pessimistic about the G20. These processes, which have become very bureaucratized, need to become more strategically politicized in a good political way. And I hope that South Africa can help make that pivot.
Right, Crispin, I'll come to you last, and perhaps you can deal with Penny's question as well. Uli, any final thoughts on how we move this from South Africa's G20 kind of hosting?
Well, South Africa has been really given an impossible task. I mean, given that the US has basically not really participated in any of the meetings, and so it's difficult. But I would say that what came out very clearly in be it Financing Common or the Financing for Development conference, that there was a strong sense of, well, the problems are not going away, so we have to deal with them. Obviously, it's, as Karen and others have alluded to, it's much more difficult to deal with these problems if the world's largest economy is just not collaborating. But I mean, I think South Africa presented a very strong agenda, a very important agenda, and it has to try to push it. Chances are that this will not move forward because there's obviously very little interest in collaboration from the US, but we will then need to find alternative fora to make things work. And so the problems are just too big to ignore them. So whatever the second best solutions are, different fora, we need to move forward. And at the end of the day, I think the point that I made before about the importance of domestic financial resource mobilization, I certainly would have liked to see more international collaboration, more financial support, ODA and all that, to help countries develop. But in a way, it also reinforces that domestic political action in advancing the economy is absolutely indispensable, and even more so in a kind of non-cooperative global environment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Really kind of over to you. Kunal, any thoughts on the way forward, kind of in the international political space?
Well, the G20, one should also keep in mind that Canada is going to be after the US, the G20, with the G20 president is going to move to Canada. And there will be a point, the Troika, where it'll be US, where it'll be South Africa and Canada on one side, and perhaps the US on the other side. And Canada, as we know, is probably a much more like-minded country right now with South Africa and many of this discussion we're having today, right? So just to keep that in mind, that it's not all doom and gloom on the G20 presidency. And I think what I would like to have seen is something that started in Brazil last year on the MDB reforms. Pretty much all the southern G20 countries want clear reforms, the MDBs, IFIs, and the World Bank and the IMF. It happened in the India presidency, Brazil too, and now South Africa. But we really haven't seen much progress there into the actual implementation of some of the reforms that have been outlined in several reports that have been commissioned by different presidencies. Can we see something concrete now in the MDB reforms? Exactly some of the things that Ulrich was mentioning earlier. Can we really see on the SDRs, on the difference of governance structures, et cetera, on low-cost financing? Can we see some clear reforms that happen this year itself, or this next year or so? That would be a big, big plus. Also, the taxation issue, Brazil presidency, a lot of it was the billionaire tax, taxing high net worth individuals. We'd like to see more progress made on that, because that's a fundamental cause of international inequality. So that, I think, South Africa can play a very important role. And of course, we know inequality being such an important issue in South Africa. So on those two issues, I'd like to see some progress in the G20 here in South Africa. And I think looking forward, we should see, hopefully, once the US has finished its turn, we might see more progress going forward in G20 itself. Thanks.
Crispin, a minute for you.
So it's still not clear to me whether we're going to have a G20 or a G19 outcome. But, two reflections in terms of the long-term sustainability of this forum. I mean, first of all, I think we should engage in what's called an exercise of javelin throwing. So you want to launch processes now that are going to land 2 years hence. And, there are various devices for doing that, setting up high-level expert groups or starting processes of inquiry. The other thing I think we should be doing is building strong linkages between these different G20 and B20, T20, C20, V20 processes. Because all of them, I think particularly for the US presidency next year, a strong B20 process coming out of South Africa will have influence during the course of next year. And we can embed this idea that, different stakeholder groups have strong representation and their views are taken into account in terms of the outcomes. Did Imran freeze on us?
I think he has frozen, yes. Crispian, maybe you as a South African want to close.
Well, then it just leaves me to, first of all, thank all of our panelists. Thank you for your time. These were an incredibly useful set of insights. I certainly enjoyed listening to all of you. And thank you to our audience. I mean, I know many of you have been actively engaged. Oh, there's Imran. He's back. Imran, I was making closing remarks on your behalf.
All
but
right,
I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much, and apologies for that. Let me thank all four of the panelists for a kind of a really exciting afternoon. I think it's kind of set us up kind of quite well for more work on this this issue of debt. Let me thank all of those that have joined us, joined us this afternoon. Do look out for kind of other events that are upcoming at SEIS, including our inequality lecture in September, and an event that we'll be hosting kind of shortly in partnership with UNU wider on issues of green industrialization. So with that, let me then close the event, and thanks to all of those